When in Dublin, Dora Montefiore seemed to illustrate the interconnections between the struggles of labour on the one hand and of women on the other. She spoke at a Dublin meeting of the Irish Women's Franchise League, explaining that the keynote of the struggle was equality between the sexes. The enfranchisement of women was not an isolated movement. Instead, she said, they should look upon their movement as a human movement where men and women stood together in the struggle. She said, we feel that that power and responsibility which men possess should be shared by women, and we want to use the industrial weapon for the emancipation of the workers. We know there is value in both, and until we can get hold of that political weapon, we are fighting with one arm tied behind our backs. So without the vote, they're fighting with one arm tied behind their backs, but they want to be part of the same struggle. Now, these, I think, are not the words of a Lady Bountiful charitable social worker, as she was characterised at the time and subsequently. So what was Dora Montefiore's view of the purpose of the Save the Kiddies scheme? Well, from her original appeal in the Daily Herald for practical support, Dora Montefiore's intentions were clear. They were working class solidarity. As she explained in her 1913 pamphlet, if we could give the children a holiday and fill them with a vision of what life might hold in the way of a cleaner and more hopeful environment, my colleagues and I might be the means not only of saving some of the children, who should be the hope of the race, but also of doing some constructive work for the future of organised industrialism. Her inspiration was the efforts of New York socialists to evacuate children, the so-called strike waifs, from the violent industrial dispute that had happened the year before in Lawrence, Massachusetts. This was, she said, an act of practical solidarity, and she felt that it, and these are her words, focused the attention of the whole world upon a particularly intense exhibition of the class struggle. The socialist care of the kiddies put heart into the Lawrence strikers and made mad the mill bosses. The kiddies must stay behind and starve was the capitalist fiat. And this brutal order aroused the indignation of all classes all over America and brought greater sympathy and practical support to the strikers. So this was an inspiration. So here was the clear politics that motivated the Save the Kiddies scheme, and which she hoped would bring the same benefits not only for the Dublin children, but also for the strikers and the wider industrial struggle. It was, she said, a humanitarian cause, but she was absolutely clear that this was not philanthropy, it was not charity. She said, we are not sentimentalists. When she spoke to the Albert Hall rally on November the 1st, alongside James Connolly and Bernard Shaw, among others, she was unequivocal. The new principle her action had endeavoured to teach was that when industrial war becomes acute at one spot, it was the duty of the workers in safer parts to remove all the children from the danger zone, just like these children were removed. There were and are different ways of reading the solidarity work that Save the Kiddies exemplified. At moments, even Dora chose strategically to represent the scheme as a charitable endeavour, as when her case was heard at the magistrates' court. However, generally she made clear that the shocking poverty of Dublin was caused by callous exploitation and landlordism, and that what she was engaged in could not be described as philanthropic or relief work. Nevertheless, Yeats, in his encyclopedic Lockout Dublin 1913, which is an incredible work, seems to actually lump her with all the other, what he calls valiant middle-class women who provided relief work, be it as sanitary visitors, socially concerned suffragists, nuns, members of St Vincent de Paul ladies' committees, union organisers, or indeed professional revolutionaries. And maybe Dora appears in the last category. If not philanthropic, this was undoubtedly seen as working class solidarity. The context for this was the much larger TUC's Dublin Strike Fund, which raised in their terms £106,000, which was a lot of money, which funded food ships on which the locked out workers' survival was heavily dependent. The scale of the Save the Kiddies scheme was much more modest, and during its lifetime, additional funds were always being requested. Instead, Montefiore felt that a byproduct of such class-based solidarity would be implanting in the minds of the workers the sense that they are gradually evolving a workers' state within the capitalist state, a state of efficient and cooperative administration of things, as opposed to a state for the government of persons. So this was a kind of prefigurative practice. This was kind of how the world might be. More practically, what the organisation of such solidarity showed was that it was possible to work purposely across sectarian divides. Dora drew attention to the way in which the scheme was taken up in Britain by official sections right across the left, trades councils, amongst suffragettes and suffragists. So there was a kind of widespread sense of solidarity with this particular issue. However, this was also a solidarity which self-consciously had a gender dimension. The first meeting at Liberty Hall had noted that Dublin mothers were prepared to trust the English mothers. And this was despite Christabel Pankhurst's later response, Christabel Pankhurst, leader of the suffragettes, and this is an extract from her newspaper, The Suffragette. And this is where she rejects all of the labour and socialist movement as a men's movement on the opposite side of the sex war to suffragettes. And the reason she came to make this statement was because of that November the 1st rally for the Dublin rebels, at which Sylvia Pankhurst appeared and drew a connection between hunger strikers like Connolly and her suffragettes, and drew a contrast that cartoon I showed you earlier highlighted, i.e. that suffragettes were treated very different, women were treated very differently by the state when they were in prison to Irish rebels, whether of the green or the orange. But it is clear that there was support from the women's movement for the workers' movement at the time. A so-called suffragist rebel paid the £25 hire of the Albert Hall so that all of the collection at the huge rally could go directly to Dublin. The same meeting was addressed by suffrage speakers like Charlotte Despard and Sylvia Pankhurst, as well as other women activists like Delia Larkin and Dora Montefiore. Other speakers made the connection too. George Lansbury, the creator of the Daily Herald and Labour MP, said, "I see no difference between the upheaval of the workers and the upheaval of their wives and sisters." James Connolly had a slightly different emphasis when he spoke of the heroic manner in which the poorest women had joined in the strike. They would rather starve to death than be untrue to their class. The symbolism of unity across the women's and industrial movement continued with 100 women collectors at this meeting and with all the stewarding done by women in suffragette colours. However, rhetorical rather than practical connections seemed easier to sustain. The involvement of Irish suffragists who wore their green and orange IWFL badges as they laboured in the soup kitchens of Liberty Hall was not mentioned in the English radical or suffrage press. But the gendering of this solidarity, and indeed of the lockout itself, is often taken for granted. Although women seem to have served the food, Dora, for example, noted a sexual division of labour at work at Liberty Hall when she visited in December 1913. And I'll use again the William Orpen sketch. It's a man who's labouring at the soup tureen, and it is women who are standing behind him. The man actually is Orpen himself. Dora said when she visited in December 1913, "Employed in various capacities are the locked out and victimised girl unionists, while a tramway man cooks the daily dinners for the mothers and another transport worker prepares the 3,000 children's breakfasts." So men did one thing, women did something else. And that's also been noted about, for example, the 1926 miners' lockout in South Wales, that you get this same this same sexual division of labour in the soup kitchens. There also seems to have been some gendering of the funds themselves. This women's solidarity was funded separately to the male trade union funds. Indeed, at one point, the Save the Kiddies Committee asked to have 5% of the larger collections earmarked for Dublin kiddies. Finally, a gendered reading of the solidarity work undertaken in relation to the Dublin lockout necessarily pushes Delia Larkin much further forward in the story than is usual. There's also a case for seeing the Save the Kiddies intervention as a militant or suffragette form of solidarity. And this is not because it was undertaken by suffragettes. It wasn't. Rather, it's because it seems to respond to the rebellious spirit of the time and fits with the suffragette slogan of deeds, not words. Did the women contribute to the lockout through their stoicism or through their direct action? Well, people were divided about that. The stoicism of the Dublin women was commented on at the time, but other women saw the issue differently. Charlotte Despard at the Albert Hall meeting said, "Women were in industry and women have to be considered. When you said that men made this, men made that, you should remember who it was that made the men." The time was past for speaking, for thinking. The time for action had come. In a similar spirit, Votes for Women claimed that the whole Larkin agitation itself would never have reached its present proportions if the militant women suffragists had not, by their example, pointed out the pathway of rebellion. It did not occur to Dora Montefiore to stay in London and merely administer a fund. She was determined to knit together the contemporary politics of direct action with practical solidarity. Montefiore had also noted that the power of past examples of industrial solidarity had been that they had acted as a form of propaganda and that they drew all sorts of other issues to them. So she was also clear that this was a way of creating a huge amount of noise around the dispute. So finally, what was the significance of the Save the Kiddies episode? Well, it certainly shows that the lockout, I think, is open to a gendered reading. In one way, this episode illustrates traditional gender roles. Women cared. They changed their minds, as some of the Dublin mothers did. They were seen principally as mothers. They were easily manipulated. They were tenacious, like Delia Larkin. In contrast, men intervened. They attempted to impose authority. They were violent. They were protective as bodyguards. So those are the kind of traditional stereotypal ways in which we expect men, or we've come to expect men and women to behave. Yet gender roles were also subverted, I think, principally through women showing that they could organise this project themselves. Save the Kiddies demonstrated cross-class solidarities, both in the team of Montefiore, Rand and Neil, but also in the London-based organising committee for the scheme. The scheme subverted apparent political divisions, showing that suffragists, suffragettes, socialists and trade unionists could work together, particularly through the new rebel networks centring on the Daily Herald. However, it was not a simple unity of interest between radicals. There was, for example, a complicated relationship between suffragettes and the lockout. Save the Kiddies also shows clear international resonances, not only in the way it drew on earlier international examples of solidarity, such as at Lawrence, but also that it in turn was covered in presses across the world. A smaller but more practical form of international solidarity was that between women workers across the Irish Sea, when women strikers in London offered to mend clothes to send on to their Dublin sisters and brothers. However, the scheme also prefigured some of the tensions that would become apparent for many progressives about doing relief work once the First World War had begun. Is it just a way of kind of supporting the status quo? The power of the event was that networks were sustained and extended through solidarity. There was, for example, a continuing relationship between Montefiore and both of the Larkins. In many ways, Dora's reporting from Dublin actually introduced Delia Larkin to a much wider radical public. Lastly, at the outset of the scheme, it had been observed that as the industrial warfare becomes keener and the workers get stronger in their fighting industrial organisations, this aspect of the campaign will become more and more important. And we hope that some permanent, not Red Cross, but Red Flag organisation will grow up to take care of the dependent non-combatants. Although described by many as a failure, The Save the Kiddies scheme was an act, I think, of working class solidarity, organised by women, which sought to show why a transnational red flag solidarity organisation was a necessity as conflicts intensified as the world wandered to war. Thank you. 2 minutes to